Welcome to the JavaScript API tutorial walkthrough video. This video is part of a series on the hows and whys of using Tableau's JavaScript API. If you're brand new to the JavaScript API, have never heard about it, and need to know why maybe somebody would use the JavaScript API, I'd hop into the JavaScript API introduction video. Also, if you've watched that introductory video and you're just ready to start writing some code, you might hop into some of the other videos. But our goal with this video is to walk you through the online tutorial so you can start to see some JavaScript API code without having to actually open up your text editor just yet. It's a really great, gentle introduction to the JavaScript API. There's companion content for this entire JavaScript API video series, and you can grab that at github.com/tableau/JS-API videos. There will be sample code as well as some walkthrough code for the other hands-on videos, and also the deck that we have here and for the other videos as well. Before we get started, let's talk about our goals for this video. Through the tutorial, we're going to show you a lot of the basics of using the JavaScript API. We'll start with what does the JavaScript API code look like to embed a Tableau visualization on a web page. The introductory walkthrough will also teach you how to use filters and tabs. You'll be able to use the JavaScript API to select marks or values on a dashboard or visualization. It'll teach you how to use the basic toolbar commands, such as exporting to PDF and CSV. It'll help you understand how to write custom JavaScript functions that respond to events happening with the viz. We call these event listeners, and they can really take your integration to the next level. Now, to start the tutorial, go to developers.tableau.com, scroll down to JavaScript API and click on that link, then scroll down to Tutorial and click Take Tutorial. I'll go ahead and do that now. Developers.tableau.com, click on Learn More under JavaScript API, and click on Take Tutorial. Then you can click on Start the Tutorial. Now, a quick note on how to follow along with this tutorial. I'm not going to talk about every character or even every word that you see in the code, but I will highlight some key important parts of the code and explain what each different function does. You can go at my pace, or feel free to hit pause and investigate the code a little bit deeper. But remember, we have other videos as well where we'll actually write the code by hand. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Now, what this tutorial does is, down below, it has some code as well as explanation of what the code does. Up above is where the dashboard will eventually live, but for right now, it hasn't been embedded, of course. Under each block of code, you can hit Run this code to see what happens on the dashboard up above. And the idea is you see the code, you run it, and you get an idea of the key functions of the JavaScript API. So the first thing you need to do to enable the JavaScript API is to initialize the viz or embed the viz. To do that, you need three key ingredients. The first is a JavaScript object that points at a div that lives on your HTML page. So what you'll do is inside of your HTML, you'll create an empty div, you'll give it an ID. In this case, it was called Tableau viz. And then you'll call document.getElement by ID to save that into a variable. You also need the URL of your dashboard that you'd like to load in a string. You also need a JavaScript object that will contain the options of how you would like this viz to be loaded. Inside of this options object, you can do things such as width, height, decide whether you'd like to hide tabs or the toolbar, as well as other things that you can see inside of the documentation. In this case, instead of choosing a specific pixel size of the width and height, we've decided to make the width and the height the same width and height of the placeholder div, that is. So it basically will fill the entire empty space up above. Finally, onFirst Interactive inside of that options object allows you to run code when the viz has finished loading. This is useful for a variety of reasons. In this case, we want to grab the workbook and active sheet objects so that we can use those in the rest of our code, which you'll see coming up. Okay, we have our three key ingredients: placeholder div, URL, and options. We take those and we pass them in to new Tableau.viz and save the resulting object in a variable called viz. The result of this code will be that we will have embedded our dashboard. And to see this happen, simply click Run this code, and the dashboard loads up above. So we've embedded our visualization, but the main reason why you enable the JavaScript API is to actually interact with it. Probably the most common thing people do is filter. Filtering is pretty easy. You need to call it on the active sheet. Remember, we got the active sheet on First Interactive, so we already have this object. If you don't, you can get it from viz.getWorkbook. So on the active sheet, we will apply the filter with apply filter async, and we'll pass in three arguments. The name of the dimension we want to filter on. This is a column or a dimension in our current dashboard. Then the value or values we'd like to filter to. So we'd like to show only rows where the region column is the Americas. And finally, we'll use the filter update type as the third argument. You can filter in different ways. For example, you can do an add where no matter what is showing, we also want to show the value that we're passing in, or remove where we, no matter what is showing, we do no longer show that one value. Replace is no matter what we're showing now, just show the values we're passing in. So if we run this code, you'll see the dashboard up above is now showing just bars for the Americas. The other most common thing to do with the JavaScript API is to switch from sheet to sheet or tab to tab. Now remember, in our options object, we actually hid the tabs, but that doesn't mean we can't actually switch from tab to tab. And this is a really impressive use case of the JavaScript API, because we'd be able to hide the tabs, but create your own interface or interaction that switches from visualization to visualization. The function for switching tabs is called activate sheet async, and you do this at the workbook level. Again, we already have the workbook from our onFirst Interactive. We save that in a variable, but we could also grab it from viz.getWorkbook. Once we have that workbook object, we call workbook.activateSheetAsync, and we simply pass in the name of the tab we'd like to switch to. So we'll hit run this code, and the dashboard up above switches to GDP per capita map. You can also select marks. Select individual circles on this map, or if in a bar chart, select individual bars. And you can do that programmatically using the JavaScript API. You'll notice that selecting marks is actually very similar to filtering. The format of that call is very similar. So we do that with a workbook.getActiveSheet. So just like filtering, we have to do it to the active sheet, whether you will have already saved that in a variable or you need to get it from viz.getWorkbook.getActiveSheet. And once you have that active sheet, you'll call select marks async. Just like before, you'll pass in the dimension, the value you'd like to select on, and then the filter or selection update type. You can actually use either here. Replace. So you could add marks and then add more marks and then add more marks using the selection update type add. Or no matter what is selected, you can replace that selection with the value you're passing in. And that's what we're doing here. So we'll run this code, and all of the Asia marks on this dashboard have been selected. Those three things, filtering, tabs, selecting, I would say those make up the basic use cases of the JavaScript API. But once you start using the JavaScript API more and more, you'll see some reasons you might want to do some more intermediate and advanced use cases and calls of the JavaScript API. And so we'll have to talk about a few more of those for the rest of the tutorial. The first is to chain calls. This falls into a bucket of asynchronous programming, and it's not specific to the Tableau JavaScript API. It's the ability to program despite the fact that a single call might take a round trip to another server, and you might need to wait for the response of that initial call. The way it applies to Tableau's JavaScript API is, let's say you need to do two things in order, and the second thing needs to wait for the first. Common example is, let's switch to a new tab, and when that is done, filter. Now, you can't just do this in the normal JavaScript way, which is to write a semicolon and then write your next command, because the switching of the tabs will still be happening when you try to run the filter. You have to do them in order. Switch tabs, wait till that's done, and then do the filter. We do that kind of waiting with this function called .then. And its syntax is a little funky at first if you're not used to promises or asynchronous programming. But once you get used to it, it's not too hard. Basically, we call our first function workbook.activateSheetAsync. This is what we've done previously. Instead of writing a semicolon at the end of that function, though, we write .then. The argument to this .then function is another function. And that is the function of the new sheet. That function is the code we want to run when the previous function is done. So activate sheet async, .then, and then everything below is what happens after that activating sheet is done. So we say .then, and we'll say active sheet equals new sheet. We grab this new sheet from our .then, which is returned as part of the .then. So we have our active sheet, and then we do just as we did before. Active sheet apply range filter, in this case, async. Side note, earlier we just did a normal categorical filter. There are all kinds of different types of filters. I recommend looking at the documentation for more types. Now, one important thing to note when you are chaining these calls together with .then is that whenever you're writing the subsequent calls inside of the .then, you'll want to start those with return. This will enable all further calls to be working off of the same promise, off of the promise of this sheet. So if you're chaining together more than two, you need to have this return in front of your call. Once that apply range filter async and the rest of this code here, we'll call .then. And then in this case, we want to select marks. And then we select marks just as we learned a moment ago. The end result is, and it might seem complicated, but like I said, once you write a few of these, it'll start to get familiar. The end result is that we will switch sheets to a specific sheet. Then we will filter. Then we will select marks. Now, as I run this code, Watch carefully because you can actually even see that sequence happening. So there we have it. It switched sheets, then it filtered, then it selected marks. If we hadn't done that, it would have only accomplished the first part without ever getting to do the last two. Another thing you might often have to do is handling the slightly complicated nature of sheets in the Tableau JavaScript API object. So the first thing you might want to do is you might want to know what all the sheets are. You've published this dashboard, your code, you need an array of sheets so that you can apply JavaScript API to them. And you can do that with workbook.getPublishedSheetsInfo. The rest of this code in this function is just giving us a pop-up that lists all of the published sheets. So we run that code, and here are 0 through 6, so 7 total worksheets in this workbook. Okay, that one's pretty straightforward. The challenge, however, and this will come up when you start to filter or select marks on a dashboard, is that you might need to know the worksheets on a dashboard. So a worksheet, a normal worksheet outside of a dashboard, of course, is just one sheet. But a dashboard can have many worksheets inside of it, and you may just want to be filtering a specific one. To do that, we need to call dashboard.getWorksheets to get an array of all of the worksheets that live inside of that dashboard. And then once again, the rest of this code simply alerts the list of worksheets on that dashboard. Now in this case, we weren't actually on a dashboard yet, so the tutorial code first activates a dashboard, and then it calls dashboard.getWorksheets. Again, it's using that chaining calls, asynchronous nature of the JavaScript API to achieve one thing and then another. The key lesson here, though, is the dashboard.getWorksheets. So when we run that, it switches to our dashboard, and it lists the 2 sheets in our dashboard. I'll show you that there's a line chart and a map up above. Now, one key thing here is that as you switch from sheet to sheet, you may want to change the size of the viz. This viz started to overflow and not have scroll bars here. It's not really the right size for this div here. And so we use a function called change size async. Change size async, which is here, allows you to specify the width and height, which we could do if we wanted to. But in this case, we actually just want to switch from the published behavior, which is specific size, which is overflowing our div, and it's not looking too well. Instead, we want to change that behavior to automatic sizing, which means it'll perfectly fit the div that it lives in. So once again, there's some code here to activate the correct sheet. But the key part here is after that's done, it calls dashboard.changeSizeAsync and changes to automatic. We'll run this code. We didn't see it switch tabs because it was already on that tab. And then it made automatic sizing, which you can see it compressed vertically and expanded horizontally to fit the size of the div. Let's talk about the toolbar. The toolbar is something where it has a lot of useful functions on it, but sometimes when you're embedding a dashboard, the look and feel of the toolbar and the location of it don't fit the look and feel of your website. So often when you're doing that kind of embedding and using the JavaScript API, you might hide the toolbar, but that doesn't mean you won't want your end user to be able to export to PDF or hit the share button or something like that. And so you can use the JavaScript API to expose that functionality. Once again, we've hidden the toolbar. That was back in our embed code. But despite that, we can call viz.showExportPDF. We can show viz.showExportPDF dialog. I'll hit run this code, and there is the PDF export dialog. You can do the same for show export image dialog, or show export crosstab, or show export data dialog. As you can imagine, these all kind of work the same. And then another key button on the toolbar is the revert all button, and we can do that as well. So we'll hit revert all, and it goes back to our the initial published version of the dashboard. All right, one last subject, and it's a key one, is event listening. Everything we've done this far is click a button and cause that to change something on the dashboard. Click a button and have it filter, or click a button and have it switch tabs or change size. But we like to say that the JavaScript API allows two-way communication between the website and the embedded visualization. The other side of that communication is event listening. You might want to have your website display something or change something when the user clicks something on the dashboard or switches from tab to tab. Or you may want to grab information from the user's interactions and save that elsewhere. And that's what event listeners are for. You can add an event listener simply with viz.addEventListener. Now there's all different types of events. For example, mark selection or tab switch or filter. In this case, we're adding a mark selection event. And the second argument is the function that we want to run when that event happens. So when the user selects marks, we want to run this function called onMarksSelection. What we want to do here is grab the marks event, which we pass into that function, and then say marks event.getMarksAsync. Once that is done, we've grabbed the marks, then we need to call our old friend.then and do something with those marks. In this case, we choose to report the selected marks, which is our own custom function to create a pop-up to show all of the selected marks. Basically, this is a lot of code on looping through all of the marks and adding those to an HTML object and then showing a pop-up with that list of marks. Most of this is not JavaScript API code, so I'll let you look through that, but I'll point out a couple of key things here. First of all, we have marks.length, which is our array of marks and the length of it. So we're looping through our array of marks. Each mark can have multiple pairs. What I mean by that is it's different columns. For example, which country is this in? Which continent is this in, or region? And what is the GDP per capita of that country? Those are all different pairs. So for each mark, we need to loop through the array of pairs and grab the information such as field name or value from that pair. The rest of the code, again, is just to append all of those values we grab, throw them into the HTML, and then open up a dialog with that HTML. Now, if you try to run this code, all that's going to do is add the event listener. So when we run this code, it says, now wait for the user selecting marks. It's not actually going to do anything until the user selects marks. So click run this code once, then grab a selection tool up here and start selecting some marks. Oops, it's been a while, so I had to reload the viz. So let's run this code again to select some marks. To add the event listener, and then select a couple marks. Or we can multi-select. Let's see here. So I can select, multi-select, and you see the list of marks as well as all of the pairs inside. You can also remove marks. You can remove any event listener. So the fact that we've given it a name on mark selection means we can remove that event listener. So I run that code again, Now as I select marks, oops, I probably need to run it one more time. Now as I select marks, no pop-up is happening. Okay, that's it for the tutorial. I hope you've understood kind of the key parts of the JavaScript API. Probably the next step if you're learning how to use the JavaScript API is to start getting your hands on some code and building out your own projects. Before you go, let's give you a few resources on where to go from here. First of all, developers.tableau.com is a really good one-stop shop for all resources related to the APIs. Specifically, you should go there to read about the JavaScript API developer docs. It has the link to the introductory tutorial that you saw here. And it also has a community forum of just Tableau developers. Really good place to ask questions about the APIs. The developers.tableau.com portal is also a really good place to find out about other APIs and Tableau SDK, Web Data Connector, etc. Anything extensibility that you want to know about. Also, I recommend going to youtube.com, searching for #datadev. This is a playlist with all of our API-related video tutorials. Specifically, I would check out the JavaScript API tutorials on embedding and interactivity. That's a good place to go after this video, where you actually get to follow along and write some code to embed and do some of the filtering we talked about today. Finally, a reminder, this slide and all of our sample code, etc. for this tutorial series is on GitHub at github.com/tableau/JSAPI videos. So if you'd like any of this content or want to look at some sample code, that's the place to go. That's it for now. Hope you've learned a lot, and we'll see you on the next video.